Hello and welcome back. Well, it's time to finally set up the Sprite Manager. It's been a few videos to get here, but we're finally here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another game object, another empty one, and we're going to name this one Sprite Manager. So here's our Sprite Manager game object. Now what we're going to do is, if you remember in one of the first videos, I mentioned that there's two different managers. There's the Sprite Manager, and then there's the Link Sprite Manager that inherits from it. The Sprite Manager, it basically will draw a sprite, but you're required to update that sprite if you want its position to change. Whereas the Link Sprite Manager will automatically readjust its position based on its parent, or it's not so much its parents, but its associated object's position. So to start with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the Sprite Manager. I'm going to associate it with just the Sprite Manager and not the Link Sprite Manager. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Sprite Manager and I'm going to drag this up to the Sprite Manager. That's going to associate the Sprite Manager um, script with the Sprite Manager game object. And if you look, it's actually looking for a material. The material that it's looking for is going to be the material of the sprite that you want to use. In this case, we want to use the ball material. So we're going to drag the ball material up to the material section. So now the Sprite Manager has what it needs to begin its initial functionality. The way to think of it is the Sprite Manager is the Sprite Manager game object is the container and the transform for the Sprite Manager script. If you remember, I mentioned that the way the Sprite Manager works is it takes and creates a quad for every sprite that you add to the Sprite Manager. It then takes all of those sprites and puts them together and builds a mesh from it. That Sprite Manager and that mesh in the Sprite Manager script is going to be associated with the Sprite Manager, and its position is going to be relative to this Sprite Manager's transform. You'll see that a little bit later on. But because of that, it's very important that we take the Sprite Manager and make sure that its positions are all zeroed out, its rotations are all zeroed out, and its scale is all set to 1. If it's not, you could get some very bizarre behavior with the sprites. So you want to make sure all of those are set to either 0 for position and rotation or 1s for scale. Once all of that is done and is in place, then you're ready to go on and start to set this up, which is what we're going to do in the next video. So I'll see you then.